It was 1 in the morning. A frantic pounding on my front door ripped through the quiet of my home like a gunshot. My daughter, Jessica, stood on the porch, drenched and shattered. "Dad," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "Trevor," he snapped. I saw the ugly purple bloom on her cheek, the split in her lip. In that instant, the quiet retiree was gone. 30 years as a federal prosecutor flooded back into my veins. My mind didn't see a daughter. It saw a victim. It saw a crime. And it began building the case that would burn her husband's world to the ground. The first exhibit was already in my hand. Before we dive into the story, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button, and let me know in the comments what you think is the most important quality in a father. The rain was relentless, a classic Seattle downpour that hammered against the windows of my study. It had been my companion for most of the evening, a soothing white noise against which I read my book, a glass of fine scotch sweating on the coaster beside me. This was the peace I had earned. After 3 decades of wrestling with the darkest aspects of human nature in a federal courthouse, retirement was a quiet harbor I had sailed into with profound relief. The house was silent, the night was deep, and my world was blessedly, predictably calm. That's why the sound was so violating. It wasn't a knock, it was an assault. A rapid, desperate thumping against the heavy oak of my front door. It wasn't someone who had forgotten their keys. It was someone running from something. My heart, which had been beating at the placid rhythm of a retiree, kicked into a higher gear. I set my book down, my senses instantly on high alert. My old training never really leaves you. You learn to analyze sounds, to profile the intentions behind them. This was the sound of pure panic. My feet were silent on the thick Persian rug in the hallway as I moved toward the door. The grandfather clock ticked loudly, each second stretching into an eternity. Who could possibly be out in this storm at 1 in the morning? My mind cycled through the grim possibilities, a habit forged by years of late-night calls about witnesses turning up dead or informants getting cold feet. Nothing good ever arrives announced by a fist in the dead of night. I reached the foyer and flipped on the porch light. Through the beveled glass sidelight, I saw a silhouette, slumped and shaking against the doorframe, the rain plastering their hair to their head. My breath caught in my throat. I undid the deadbolt with a heavy thunk, my hand closing around the cold brass knob. I pulled the door inward, and the storm swept into my home, bringing with it the wreckage of my daughter's life. For a split second, my brain refused to process the image. It was Jessica, but a version of her I had never seen. Her beautiful blonde hair was a mess of dark, wet strands clinging to her face. Her expensive wool coat, one I knew her husband had bought her, was soaked through and stained with mud at the hem, but it was her face that stopped my world from turning. Her left eye was swollen, surrounded by a grotesque, blossoming bruise that spread from her temple to her cheekbone. Her lower lip was split, a line of dark, dried blood tracing a path to her chin. Her eyes, usually so full of life and light, were vacant, staring through me as if I were a ghost. She looked like a victim from one of my old case files. "Jess?" I whispered, my voice sounding foreign in my own ears. She tried to speak, but only a shuddering sob came out. Then she stumbled forward, collapsing into my arms. Her weight was dead, and I staggered back a step, my arms wrapping around her shaking frame. She was ice cold, trembling uncontrollably, her face buried in my chest. The scent of rain and something metallic and sharp, the scent of blood, filled my senses. Fear. It has a smell, and after 30 years I knew it better than any cologne. Trevor, he finally snapped. "Dad." The words were muffled against my shirt, broken and raw. They were the 3 words I had been subconsciously dreading for years. Something inside me shifted. It was a cold, clean snap, like a switch being flipped. The warm, worried father receded, and the prosecutor took his place. The shock and horror were still there, but they were now being encased in ice, channeled into a cold, methodical purpose. The blood roaring in my ears wasn't the sound of panic. It was the sound of a mind coming online, of legal gears beginning to grind with terrifying efficiency. My grip on her tightened, not just for comfort, but to steady myself against the tidal wave of cold fury that threatened to consume me. "Inside. Now," I said, my voice steady, betraying none of the chaos inside me. I guided her out of the rain and shut the door. the heavy sound of the deadbolt sliding home feeling like the first official act of war. I led her through the foyer and into the warm light of the kitchen. She moved like a sleepwalker, each step a monumental effort. I eased her into one of the chairs at the kitchen island, and she slumped into it, her vacant eyes staring at the polished granite countertop. The bright overhead lights were cruel, revealing the full extent of the damage. I could see the distinct shape of fingers on her jawline, now beginning to darken. I saw the raw red skin on her neck, where something, a necklace, maybe had been violently torn away. He hadn't just hit her. He had grabbed her, controlled her. "Don't move," I commanded softly. I went to the freezer, my movements precise and economical. I pulled out a soft gel ice pack, wrapped it in a clean dish towel, and brought it to her. She flinched when I gently pressed it against her swollen eye, a small, wounded sound escaping her lips. Her good eye looked up at me, filled with a shame so profound it felt like a physical blow. "I'm so sorry, Dad," she whispered. "This is not your fault," I said, my voice like steel. "Nothing you did or said could ever make this your fault. Do you understand me, Jessica?" She nodded weakly, her gaze dropping back to the counter. I pulled my phone from my pocket. The clinical, detached part of my brain was now fully in control. I opened the camera, the flash making her blink. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice thin. "Documenting," I said flatly. "Turn your head to the left. A little more." I took a series of pictures, my mind already thinking about timestamps, metadata, and their admissibility in court. Her face from multiple angles, the marks on her jaw, her throat. "We're going to need these." She didn't protest. She just sat there, a broken doll in my warm kitchen, letting me collect the first pieces of evidence for the case I was already building against the man I had once welcomed into my family. The man whose life I was now going to systematically dismantle, piece by legal piece. I lowered the phone, the clinical images of her injuries burning themselves onto the back of my eyelids. My daughter Jessica sat at my kitchen island, a ghost wrapped in a dish towel, the ice pack held to her blossoming bruise. My mind, a place that was once a library of legal precedent and courtroom strategy, was now just a single searing question. How did I not see this coming? The signs were there. They were always there, written in invisible ink that only tonight's brutal truth had finally revealed. My memory flashed, not to another crime scene, but to what I had once considered the happiest day of her life, a day now tainted, revealed not as a beginning, but as the cornerstone of a meticulously constructed lie. Her wedding day. It was 8 years ago, a flawless September afternoon in Woodinville wine country. The venue was a monument to modern architecture, a breathtaking structure of glass, steel, and reclaimed cedar perched on a hill overlooking rows of perfect, heavy-laden grapevines. It was the kind of place Trevor had insisted upon: expensive, impressive, and just a little impersonal. A perfect facade. I saw Jess as if it were yesterday. She was standing in the bridal suite, the afternoon sun streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning her white dress into a halo. She had never looked more beautiful, her face luminous with a hope so pure and powerful it felt like a tangible force in the room. She was practically vibrating with joy, a joy I had mistaken for certainty. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" I had asked her, my own voice thick with emotion as I helped her with a final pin in her hair. "More than I ever thought possible, Dad," she'd said, and her smile was so genuine I never thought to question it. Then there was Trevor. He was the epitome of the successful Seattle tech executive. He wore a custom-tailored suit that probably cost more than my first car. His smile was a weapon of effortless charm, and he moved through the crowd of guests with the unshakable confidence of a man who had never been told no. Everyone was impressed. My sister pulled me aside to say how lucky Jess was to have found such a handsome, successful, and devoted man. At the time, I agreed. I watched his hand linger on the small of Jess's back and saw devotion. Now I know it was ownership. The first crack in the facade appeared during the reception toasts. Jess stood, glass in hand, to tell a funny, self-deprecating story about their disastrous first date. She was halfway through the anecdote, her timing perfect, the guests laughing along when Trevor cut in. "Oh, honey, that's not how it happened. You're forgetting the best part," he said, taking the microphone from her hand with a charming laugh. He retold the story, his version, which was slicker, funnier, and made him the clear hero of the evening. The guests roared with laughter. No one but me seemed to notice the way the light in Jess's eyes dimmed, her smile tightening just a fraction as she sat down. He hadn't just interrupted her. He had stolen her narrative, corrected it, and presented his as the official record. I told myself it was just wedding day nerves, a groom wanting to look good. What a fool I was. Later, during the father-daughter dance, as we swayed to a song we'd both loved since she was a little girl, she leaned her head on my shoulder. "He's amazing, isn't he?" she whispered. But there was a tremor in her voice, a faint note of questioning that my happy, tear-filled heart refused to acknowledge. The song ended, and before I could even kiss her cheek, Trevor was there. He didn't ask to cut in, he simply took her. His hand clamped onto her hip, pulling her into him with a firmness that was more possessive than passionate. As they danced away, I watched his thumb rub circles on her hip bone, a gesture that looked less like a caress and more like a claim. The final, chilling detail came back to me as I stood in my kitchen, 8 years later. It was near the end of the night. I overheard him talking to one of his groomsmen while Jess was speaking to her aunt. The groomsman asked what was next for them, now that Trevor had gotten another big promotion. "Jess has some ideas about starting her own design firm," Trevor had said with a dismissive chuckle. He glanced over at his new bride, a woman with a degree in graphic design and a portfolio that had won awards in college. "Don't you worry your pretty little head about that," he'd said to her from across the room, a lazy, confident smile on his face. "I'll make sure you never have to work another day in your life." It sounded like a promise, a gift. Everyone around him smiled, thinking how generous he was. But it wasn't a gift. It was a sentence. It was the first bar of the gilded cage he was already building around her. And I, her father, the man sworn to protect her, had stood by and admired the craftsmanship. That comment at the wedding, the one that sounded like a promise, was indeed a sentence. And as I stood in my kitchen, the rain still lashing at the windows, my mind began to connect the dots of the years that followed, drawing a horrifyingly clear picture of how that sentence was carried out. Trevor didn't lock Jess in a room. He was far too clever for that. Instead, he built a cage with bars of love, concern, and financial prudence, and convinced her it was a palace built just for her. The first step was dismantling her ambition. Jess had been so excited to launch her own freelance graphic design business after they were married. Her portfolio was brilliant, and she'd already lined up a few small but promising clients. Trevor, however, expertly smothered that spark with affection. "I just want you to be able to create without pressure, baby." I remember him telling her over dinner one night, "Let me handle the bills. You just focus on your art." He encouraged her to turn down paying gigs in favor of passion projects, designing their wedding thank you cards, creating a logo for a friend's non-existent startup, and, most consuming of all, managing the complete interior design of their new, multi-million-dollar home on the lake. He made her career feel like a hobby, a charming little pastime that shouldn't interfere with the serious business of being his wife. Then came the financial control, which he disguised as responsible planning. I remember meeting Jess for lunch about 2 years into their marriage. When the bill came, her card was declined. A deep, painful blush crept up her neck as she fumbled for another. "It's so embarrassing," she'd mumbled, avoiding my eyes. "Trevor has us on a new budgeting app. He manages all the accounts, it's just easier. He's so much better with that stuff than I am, and I get an allowance for groceries and things." An allowance. My daughter, a college-educated woman, was being given an allowance like a teenager. My prosecutor's mind screamed control, but I softened my voice. "An allowance, Jess? Is that really necessary?" She rushed to his defense. "It's for our future, Dad. We're saving. You wouldn't believe how much he's putting away." 2 weeks later, Trevor pulled up to my house in a brand new Tesla, the electric engine purring with the sound of money she wasn't allowed to touch. He called it an investment in green technology. I called it what it was, a blatant, cruel hypocrisy. The final wall of the cage was social isolation. Her friends, the vibrant, funny, intelligent women she'd known since college, began to disappear from her life. I saw it happen firsthand. Her best friend Sarah, a sharp-witted journalist, came over for dinner one evening. Trevor was the perfect host, but he spent the night making subtle, condescending remarks about Sarah's career, her small apartment in the city, her unsettled lifestyle. After she left, I overheard him talking to Jess in the kitchen. "I don't know, honey," he'd said, his voice laced with false concern. "She just seems so negative. Don't you think people like that kind of drag you down?" He did this with all of her old friends one by one, planting seeds of doubt until her social life consisted only of his work colleagues and their quiet, polished wives. He didn't forbid her from seeing her friends. He just made her feel bad about it, until she chose the path of least resistance. He made the cage her comfort zone. And I, witnessing all of this, said nothing. I'd bite my tongue, telling myself it wasn't my place, that I shouldn't be a meddling father-in-law. My silence was his accomplice. My inaction was the mortar that held the bricks of her prison together. Of all my failures, of all the moments of willful blindness and cowardly silence, one memory stands apart. It's the one that plays in my mind on a loop in the dark hours of the night, the one that I see now as my last, best chance to have stopped this nightmare before it consumed my daughter completely. It was a 4th of July, just last year, a day that should have been a celebration of freedom, but for Jess, I now realize, it was anything but. The scene was insultingly perfect. Trevor and Jess were hosting their annual barbecue at their magnificent lakefront home. The sun was a brilliant gold coin in a cloudless sky, glittering off the deep blue water of Lake Washington. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and charcoal smoke. Boats with American flags trailing behind them zipped across the water, and the happy shrieks of my grandchildren playing on the lawn were the perfect summer soundtrack. It was a postcard of the American dream, a life of success and happiness so flawless it could have been staged for a magazine. And in the middle of it all was Jess, playing the perfect hostess. But something was wrong. It was 85 degrees, humid and hot, yet she was wearing a thin, long-sleeved white cardigan over her sundress. I noticed it right away. It was a subtle but jarring dissonance, a note played in the wrong key. I watched her for a while, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe she was just sensitive to the Sunday, but she'd always loved the Sunday. I finally found a moment to speak with her alone when she was by the drink cooler, away from the flow of guests. "Aren't you hot in that, sweetheart?" I asked, my voice casual, trying not to sound accusatory. She looked up, startled, as if I'd caught her doing something wrong. "Oh, this?" she said, plucking at the sleeve. "No. It gets a little breezy by the water." It wasn't breezy. The air was still and heavy. As she reached into the ice for a bottle of water, the sleeve of the cardigan slid up her arm just an inch. But it was enough. There, on the delicate skin of her inner wrist, was a faint but unmistakable cluster of bruises. They were purplish yellow, already starting to fade, but their shape was horrifyingly clear. It was the distinct pattern of fingers, the ghost of a grip tightened with force. My blood went cold. My voice came out low and steady, the way it did in an interrogation room. "Jess, what happened to your arm?" Panic flashed in her eyes. It was a flicker of pure terror, so quick that if you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it. She yanked the sleeve down violently, her other hand coming up to clutch at her arm. Her eyes darted across the lawn, scanning, searching. I knew who she was looking for. "Oh my God, that—" "It's nothing, Dad, honestly," she stammered, forcing a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "I am so clumsy. I walked right into the edge of the pantry door in the dark a few days ago. I swear, I bruised like a peach." It was a terrible lie. A clumsy, obvious lie. I'd seen 1,000 lies on the witness stand, and this one was an insult to my intelligence. The shape was wrong, the placement was wrong, and her reaction was a confession in itself. I opened my mouth to press her, to tell her I didn't believe her, to demand the truth. But I never got the chance. From across the expansive green lawn, I saw Trevor. He had stopped talking to a colleague and was looking directly at us. He wasn't smiling. His face was a thundercloud, his eyes fixed on us with a cold, possessive intensity. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. It was a look of pure ownership and warning, a silent command that was as clear as a shout. Jess saw him too, and I felt her shrink, her entire posture collapsing in on itself. The panic in her eyes was replaced by a desperate, forced brightness. "I should go check on the burgers," she chirped, her voice painfully cheerful. And then she was gone, walking, almost fleeing back across the lawn toward him. I stood there by the cooler, my heart hammering against my ribs, a cold drink in my hand. Every fiber of my being, every instinct honed over a 30-year career, was screaming. He did that to her. She is lying to protect him. She is terrified. I should have walked over there. I should have taken my daughter by the hand, put her and my grandchildren in my car, and driven away. I should have confronted him right then and there, in front of all his important friends. But I didn't. I stood frozen by my own inaction, paralyzed by the fear of making a scene, of being wrong, of pushing my daughter away forever. I let her go. And that single, silent glare from across the lawn was the moment I truly understood that my daughter wasn't in a difficult marriage. She was in custody. The memory of that 4th of July, of my own pathetic inaction, was so vivid it felt like I was still standing there on that sun-drenched lawn, paralyzed. A small, almost imperceptible sound pulled me back across the chasm of time, the soft clink of the ice pack against the granite countertop. I wasn't at a barbecue. I was in my kitchen at nearly 2 in the morning, and my daughter was here, broken. The time for regret was a luxury I could no longer afford. My guilt was useless to her now. Action was the only thing that mattered. "Let's go to my study," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "The light is softer in there." It was a lie. The light was the same. But the kitchen felt too open, too bright, too normal for the story I knew she was about to tell. My study was a fortress of leather and old books, a place of quiet contemplation and, for 30 years, relentless strategy. It was the right place to take a formal statement. My mind was already making the shift. I settled her into the deep leather armchair opposite my desk and poured her a small glass of brandy, which she took with trembling hands. I sat in my own chair, the worn leather groaning in the quiet room. For a moment I just looked at her, my heart a leaden weight in my chest. "Jess," I said softly. "You told me," he snapped. "I need you to tell me everything. From the beginning. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small it seems." She took a shaky breath, the brandy sloshing in her glass. When she began to speak, her voice was flat, hollowed out, the voice of someone describing a terrible movie they had been forced to watch. "It was the money," she started, her eyes fixed on a distant point beyond the rain-streaked window. It never added up. The Tesla, the ridiculously expensive business dinners, the watches. He told me we were on a tight budget, but he was living like a king. I thought he was just hiding debt from me. I was worried we were going to lose everything. She explained how, 2 days ago, she'd needed a copy of their tax returns for the kids' financial aid application for school. Trevor had been dismissive, telling her he'd handle it, but she needed it that day. She went onto their shared cloud drive, a digital space she rarely entered, and started searching. Tucked away in a mislabeled folder called Old Projects, she found it. Not the tax returns, but a second, hidden world. There were credit card statements she'd never seen, for accounts in his name only. Statements filled with charges for 5-star hotels in the city, jewelry from Tiffany's, and dinners at restaurants that cost $1,000 a plate. "And then I found the emails," she whispered, her voice cracking. He'd been careless. He set up a rule to auto-archive them, but he must have forgotten to delete the folder. There were hundreds of them, between him and a woman from his marketing department. Kendra, Jess said the name as if it were poison on her tongue. They weren't just love letters, Dad. They were business plans. He was bragging to her. Bragging about how he was siphoning funds from a discretionary marketing account at his company. He called it his bonus program. He was embezzling for years to pay for her, for all of it. The word hung in the air of my quiet study. Embezzlement. A federal crime. My mind lit up with the cold, bright fire of legal possibility. Wire fraud. Larceny. This changed everything. She described how she'd spent the entire day in a state of shock, printing every last piece of evidence. When Trevor got home that evening, she was waiting for him. She had laid the printouts on their gleaming marble kitchen island like a funeral shroud. "I was so calm," she said, a note of wonder in her voice. "I just asked him to explain it." His reaction, she said, was not shame. It was not remorse. It was pure, unadulterated rage, the fury of a king whose authority had been questioned. He didn't deny it. He attacked her. He called her a pathetic, snooping child. He told her she had no idea how the world worked, that he had earned that money, that he deserved a life with someone exciting and alive, someone like Kendra, not a tired, boring housewife who had let herself go. He said he was glad she found out, that he was sick of hiding, sick of pretending to be happy with her. "I told him he was a criminal," Jess said, her voice dropping lower. "I told him I was taking the children and that I was going to send a copy of these emails to his company's board of directors. I said I was done. That," she explained, is when he snapped. The verbal violence became physical. He moved so fast, she recounted, her body starting to tremble again. He shoved me, hard. I flew backward and my hip crashed into the corner of the wine fridge. I fell, and my head hit the floor. I watched her hand unconsciously move to her hip and made a mental note. Check for more bruising. Before I could even process what happened, he was on top of me. His knees were pinning my arms and his hands were around my throat. She stopped, her own hand flying to her neck, touching the faint marks there. I couldn't breathe, Dad. He squeezed, and he was screaming in my face. His face was all twisted and ugly. He called me a worthless bitch. He said if I ever threatened him again, he would kill me. He said he would put me in the ground and tell everyone I just ran away. The ice in my veins was now a solid block of glacial fury. I kept my face a mask of calm, but under the desk my hands were clenched so tight my knuckles were white. He finally let go, she continued, sobbing now. He threw me toward the door. He said, "Get out of my house. Go on, run back to your daddy." And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was her, Kendra. She was upstairs the whole time, and as I was scrambling to find my purse and my keys, I could hear them. They were laughing, Dad. He was holding my throat 1 second, and the next they were upstairs, laughing together. She finally broke down completely, her body racked with deep, agonizing sobs. I moved from behind my desk and knelt in front of her, pulling her into my arms. I held my daughter while she cried out all the pain and poison of 8 years of lies. I held her, and I let my own cold, calculated rage solidify into a diamond-hard purpose. He hadn't just assaulted my daughter. He hadn't just stolen from his company. He had confessed. He had provided a motive, and in his supreme arrogance, he had handed me every weapon I would ever need to utterly and completely destroy him. The trial had already begun, right here in this room, and I knew with absolute certainty how it was going to end. I held her in my arms until the last of the shuddering sobs subsided into ragged, exhausted breaths. The story was told, the poison was out, and all that was left was a profound, hollowed-out weariness. She was spent, a swimmer who had finally reached the shore after a decade in a raging sea. "You need to sleep," I whispered, helping her to her feet. "You're safe now. I promise you, you are finally and completely safe." I led her down the hall to the guest room, the room that had been hers throughout her teenage years. I turned down the covers on the bed, found an old soft t-shirt of mine for her to wear, and poured her a glass of water. She moved with the slow, deliberate motions of someone in deep shock. As she sat on the edge of the bed, she looked up at me, her one good eye searching my face. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice small and childlike. I gently brushed the damp hair from her forehead. "I'm going to do what I do best," I said, my voice leaving no room for doubt. "Now sleep. When you wake up, the world will have already started to change." I waited until her breathing evened out, the deep, heavy sleep of total exhaustion finally claiming her. Then, I pulled the door, almost closed, leaving just a sliver of light from the hallway, and walked back to my study. The moment the study door clicked shut behind me, the world narrowed. The father who had just tucked his broken daughter into bed was gone. The man who remained was someone else entirely, a version of myself I hadn't been for 5 years, but who felt as familiar as my own skin. I walked to my desk not as a retiree, but as a prosecutor returning to his office after being handed the case of his career. The grief, the rage, the profound, soul-deep ache for my daughter's suffering, they were all still there. But they were no longer a flood threatening to drown me. They were fuel, a cold fusion reactor igniting in my chest, powering the vast, silent machinery of my mind. This was my uniform. Not a badge and a gun, but the quiet, intense focus that had dismantled organized crime families and sent corrupt politicians to federal prison. It was the ability to compartmentalize, to take a chaotic, horrific mess of human pain and see it for what it was, a set of facts, a pattern of behavior, a series of violations, and a clear path to justice. I sat down in my leather chair and took a moment, letting the transformation complete itself. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and retrieved a fresh, untouched yellow legal pad and my old Mont Blanc pen, a gift from my team after we won the Kellerman racketeering case. The pen felt perfectly balanced in my hand, an extension of my will. I wrote at the top of the page, the black ink stark against the yellow paper. Case Prelim, Jessica Blackwood v. Trevor Vance. I used her maiden name. It wasn't a mistake. It was a declaration. I drew 2 vertical lines down the page, creating 3 columns. My mind was already organizing the assault, structuring the attack on 3 fronts. In the first column, I wrote, criminal charges, state divided by federal. Beneath it, I listed them out, the words flowing from a place of deep, instinctual knowledge. Assault and battery, state of Washington. Strangulation, felony assault, state. Witness intimidation divided by coercion, state, I will kill you. Larceny embezzlement, corporate potential fed. Jurisdiction, wire fraud. Federal, use of email across state lines to facilitate crime. In the second column, I wrote, civil action. This was the part that would bankrupt him, socially and financially. Petition for divorce, immediate filing, irreconcilable differences divided by cruelty. Emergency protective order geteilt durch Tro, ex parte, immediate. Petition for asset freeze, crucial, prevent liquidation divisé par eating funds. Petition for sole custody of minor children, non-negotiable. And in the final column, the engine of the whole enterprise. Evidence and witnesses. Victim testimony, J. Blackwood, primary. Photographic evidence. Injuries. Time stamped the 23rd of August, 2025. Medical report. Action. Schedule doctor. Appointment. AM. Digital evidence. Emails. Bank statements. CC records. To be subpoenaed. Primary witness. Kendra Rossi. Potential accessory divided by co-conspirator. Leverage for testimony. I stared at the page. It was a blueprint for annihilation, all executed within the beautiful, precise, and utterly unforgiving confines of the law. There would be no vigilante justice, no heated confrontations in the street. I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. He would be dismantled systematically, clinically, and publicly by the very system he held in such contempt. The state charges would put him in a cell. The federal investigation would destroy his career and reputation. The civil suit would take his money, his home, and his children. He saw himself as a king, a master of the universe. He had no idea he had just declared war on a man who had spent his entire life writing the rules of engagement. I looked at the legal pad, at the clean black ink outlining his doom. The fire in my chest had cooled into something far more dangerous. Certainty. The plan was on the page. Now, it was time to assemble the team. I looked at the clock on my desk. The digital display glowed. 2:47 a.m. The storm outside had softened to a persistent drizzle. The night was at its deepest, a time when the world felt asleep and vulnerable. But I had never felt more awake. I picked up my phone, my movements deliberate. The time for planning was over. It was time to activate the network I had spent a lifetime building. My thumb scrolled through my contacts, past the names of neighbors and relatives, to a small protected group I simply had labeled assets. The first name on the list was Mike Rourke, a detective and a damn good one. I'd seen the potential in him when he was a rookie patrolman and had taken him under my wing. Now he was one of the sharpest investigators in the Seattle PD's domestic violence unit. I knew he would answer. I pressed the call button. It rang 3 times before he picked up, his voice thick with sleep. Rourke. Mike, it's Arthur Blackwood, I said, my voice low and even. I'm calling in the biggest favor you owe me. The sleep vanished from his voice instantly. Art? What do you need? Domestic violence, I said, dispensing with pleasantries. Felony assault. The victim is my daughter, Jessica. The suspect is her husband, Trevor Vance. I gave him the address of the lakefront house. I need a quiet, professional response unit at his residence at precisely 0600 hours, not a minute before. I want him taken completely by surprise as he's getting ready for work. There was a stunned silence on the other end, then, Jesus, Art, is Jess okay? She's with me. She's safe, I said, clipping off the emotional inquiry. We could talk about that later. I have probable cause and date-stamped photographic evidence of significant injuries consistent with strangulation. It's more than enough for a temporary hold. I need your best people, Mike, and I will be present to observe. You got it, he said, his voice now grim and professional. My partner and I will take the call ourselves. 0600. We'll be there. I hung up without saying goodbye. One pillar was in place. My next call was to Amelia Chen. She was a junior partner at my old firm, a brilliant, ferociously ambitious corporate lawyer who specialized in forensic accounting and white-collar crime. I had hired her straight out of law school. She owed her career to me, and she knew it. Mr. Blackwood, she answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and alert, even at this ungodly hour. Is everything all right? Amelia, apologies for the time. I have a situation requiring your specific expertise and absolute discretion. I laid it out for her in stark, legal terms. I am in possession of preliminary evidence, email chains, and financial records indicating significant, long-term embezzlement and wire fraud committed by a senior executive at Omnitech. The executive's name is Trevor Vance. I heard the soft click of a keyboard on her end. Vance. We know the name. This is big. It is. This is also connected to a severe domestic violence incident involving my daughter. I need you to draft a petition to freeze all known assets, personal, joint, and any suspected corporate shell accounts. I need it ready to file the second the courthouse opens this morning. I'll have a courier deliver a thumb drive with the evidence to your home within the hour. Her reply was immediate, without a hint of hesitation. Consider it done, Mr. Blackwood. He won't be able to access a dime by 9:05 a.m. 2 pillars. I disconnected and immediately dialed the third and final number. David Egan, the Chief Deputy District Attorney for King County. We had come up through the ranks together. He was a good man and a smart lawyer. Art, you better have a damn good reason for this, he grumbled. Dave, just giving you a professional courtesy, I said. A high-profile arrest is going to land on your desk in about 4 hours. Trevor Vance, the COO of Omnitech. You're kidding me. On what? Felony domestic assault for starters, I said. But be prepared. There's a significant white-collar component. Embezzlement, wire fraud. The evidence is damning. This is going to be a media circus, and I wanted you to hear it from me first so your office isn't playing catch-up. There was a long pause. This isn't just a tip, is it, Art? This is personal. The victim, I said, my voice flat, is my daughter. The silence on the other end was heavy with understanding. I see, he finally said, his tone shifting from irritated to serious. Thank you for the heads up, Art. I'll make sure it's assigned to our most senior DV prosecutor. It will be handled by the book, but with appropriate attention. I hung up the phone and placed it on my desk. It was 3:15 a.m. In less than 30 minutes, I had activated the police, the county's top prosecutor, and one of the city's best corporate law firms. 3 calls. The trap was now set. The gears of the law, which so often grind slowly, were now spinning with terrifying speed, all aimed at one man, sleeping peacefully in his bed, completely unaware that his life as he knew it was already over. All we had to do now was wait for the dawn. The hours between 3 a.m. and 5:30 a.m. were a strange, suspended limbo. I didn't sleep. I sat in my study, the legal pad on the desk in front of me, a single lamp cutting a circle of light in the darkness. I was a general in my tent on the eve of a battle, the plans drawn, the troops mustered, waiting for the first light. When my watch read 5:40 a.m., I stood, put on a dark, conservative suit and tie, and walked out into the pre-dawn chill. The rain had stopped, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and pine. There would be no storm to hide what was about to happen. The world would see it in the clear, unforgiving light of morning. I met Detective Rourke and his partner, a stern, capable-looking woman named Officer Chen, in a quiet residential street 2 blocks from Trevor's house. I got out of my car as they approached, the sky behind them beginning to soften from inky black to a bruised purple. Art, Mike said, his expression grim. You sure about this? You being here? I'm not here as a prosecutor, Mike. I'm here as the victim's father, I said, handing him a slim thumb drive. This is your probable cause. High-resolution photos of my daughter's injuries, taken at 1:45 this morning. The metadata is intact. Rourke glanced at his partner. Okay, we'll take the lead. You stay back. You observe. That's it. Understood? Understood, I said. We drove the final 2 blocks in a silent 3-car procession. Rourke's unmarked sedan slid to the curb directly in front of the house at 5:59 a.m. I parked across the street, my position giving me a perfect, unobstructed view of the front door. The house was a monument to Trevor's ego, all sharp angles, cold glass, and dark steel. It looked less like a home and more like a corporate headquarters. Trevor's gleaming black Tesla was in the driveway. Next to it was a white Lexus coupe I didn't recognize. Kendra's. She'd stayed the night. Good. At 6 a.m. on the dot, Rourke and Chen walked up the stone pathway. Rourke's knock was solid and authoritative, a sound that demanded a response. A full minute passed. Lights flicked on inside. Then, the door opened. Trevor stood there, wrapped in a ridiculously expensive-looking silk robe, a mug of coffee in his hand. He blinked, annoyance and arrogance warring for dominance on his handsome face. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with the condescension of a man who believed himself to be untouchable. "Mr. Trevor Vance?" Rourke asked, his voice pure, professional monotone. "I'm Detective Rourke. This is Officer Chen. We're here to investigate a report of a domestic disturbance." Trevor actually laughed. It was a short, humorless bark. "A disturbance? Officers, I think there's been a misunderstanding. My wife and I had a disagreement last night. She's a bit emotional, you know how it is. She went to her father's to cool off. That was my cue. I got out of my car and walked slowly to the edge of his property, stopping on the public sidewalk. I made sure he saw me. His eyes locked on mine, and for the first time the confident Facade faltered. The color drained from his face. "Arthur?" he stammered. "What the hell is this? What are you doing here?" "My daughter is emotional, Trevor?" I asked, my voice calm and conversational, though it carried across the manicured lawn with perfect clarity. "Is that what you call it when you leave bruises on her face?" "That's a lie," he snapped, turning back to the detectives. "She's clumsy." She tripped and fell running out of the house after our argument. I took another step forward. "A fall," I said, addressing Rourke, but looking directly at Trevor. "Interesting theory. Detective, you'll note in the photographs that the contusions on her cheek and jaw, and the petechial hemorrhaging in her left eye, are inconsistent with a fall onto a flat surface. They are, however, classic indicators of a significant blow from a closed fist. Furthermore, the ligature pattern bruising on her neck is consistent with manual strangulation, which, as you know, is a Class C felony in the state of Washington." Trevor stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. He was realizing, far too late, that this was not a simple domestic dispute. This was a prosecution. Just then, a woman appeared at the top of the stairs behind him, wrapped in an identical silk robe. Kendra. She looked sleepy, confused, and annoyed, until she saw the two uniformed officers and me standing on the lawn. She froze. "Trevor, what is going on?" she demanded. "It's nothing, baby. Go back upstairs," he hissed. But it was too late. "Ma'am, we'll need your name," Officer Chen said, her voice sharp. Trevor tried to take back control. "She has nothing to do with this. This is a private family matter. You have no right to be here without a warrant. The visible injuries on the victim, as documented, give us probable cause to investigate an assault," Rourke said flatly. "And your wife's testimony gives us reason to believe this woman was a witness." He turned his attention to Kendra. "Ma'am, did you witness an altercation last night?" "Don't say a word, Kendra," Trevor ordered. Kendra looked from Trevor's panicked face to the stern, waiting faces of the police. She was trapped, and I decided it was time to spring the final part of the trap. I addressed my next words to Detective Rourke, but my tone was pitched for Kendra's ears alone. "Detective, it's important for you to be aware that the domestic assault was not the primary issue. It was precipitated by my daughter discovering incontrovertible evidence that Mr. Vance has been embezzling substantial funds from his employer, Omnitech." Trevor's face went from pale to sheet white. Kendra's eyes widened in shock. I continued, my gaze now settling on her with something approaching pity. "Wire fraud is a serious federal offense, and the law is very clear that any individual found to have knowingly benefited from or helped to conceal the proceeds of such a crime could be charged as an accessory after the fact. The federal sentencing guidelines for that are quite severe. It would be a terrible shame for a young woman to destroy her entire future over one bad decision." That was it. The kill shot. I saw the calculation in Kendra's eyes. She looked at Trevor, no longer as a powerful benefactor, but as a sinking ship about to drag her to the bottom of the ocean. Her loyalty, built on a foundation of stolen money and lies, evaporated in an instant. She broke. "I didn't know he was going to hurt her," she blurted out, tears welling in her eyes. "He was just so angry that she found the emails." He pushed her, she fell, and then he was on top of her. He grabbed her throat. "He told me he was leaving her. He said everything was going to be fine." Rourke looked at his partner. That was the corroborating statement they needed. "Mr. Vance," he said, stepping forward, "please turn around and place your hands behind your back. You are under arrest for assault in the second degree." "You can't do this!" Trevor shrieked, backing away. "This is insane!" But it was over. Chen was already behind him, expertly pulling his arms back. The sharp, metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the quiet morning air. I watched as they led him, babbling and protesting, out of his glass palace in his ridiculous silk robe. Neighbors were on their porches now, watching the COO of Omnitech being placed in the back of a police car like a common criminal. I stood on the lawn as the patrol car pulled away, taking the architect of my daughter's misery with it. There was no joy, no triumph. Just the profound, grim satisfaction of watching the first, and most important, invoice for his crimes finally being paid in full. I stood on that manicured lawn for a long time after the police cars disappeared down the street, the morning sun now fully above the trees, glinting off the cold glass of Trevor's house. The adrenaline from the confrontation was draining away, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep weariness. The battle was won, but the war had just begun. I got back in my car and drove home, not with the triumphant surge of a victor, but with the heavy heart of a man who knew the true cost of the fight ahead. When I walked back into my house, the scent of fresh coffee filled the air. I found Jess in the kitchen, sitting at the island where she had collapsed just hours before. She had showered and was wearing some of her old clothes she'd left in her childhood closet. She was nursing a mug of coffee, her face pale and drawn, the bruise on her cheek a stark, ugly contrast to her clean skin. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wide with 1,000 unasked questions. I walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "He's been arrested, Jess," I said, my voice quiet. "They took him into custody. It's done." For a moment, she didn't react. Then, her shoulders began to shake. The coffee mug rattled in its saucer as she set it down. It wasn't a loud, dramatic cry, but a silent, shuddering sob of pure, unadulterated relief. The tension that had held her together for years, the constant low-level fear that had been her companion for a decade finally broke. "Is it really over?" she whispered through her tears. I pulled up a stool and sat across from her. I had to give her the truth. "The immediate threat is over," I said gently. "But now, the next part begins. The hard part." She looked at me, confused, and I knew I had to lay it all out for her. This was the part of the system that chewed people up, the part I had guided countless victims through. "This is a marathon, sweetheart, not a sprint," I began, my voice shifting into the calm, procedural tone I'd used so many times before. "There are things we have to do, today, to build the legal wall around you, and the kid's so high he can never touch you again." I ticked the points off on my fingers. "First, we're going downtown. You need to give Detective Rourke your official, on the record statement. It will be the foundation of the entire criminal case against Trevor. It's crucial that we do it while the events are fresh in your mind." She nodded, her eyes wide as she listened. "Second, after that, I'm taking you to see a doctor I know. We need a full medical report. A professional needs to document every bruise, every mark, every injury. It's not for treatment, it's for the court. It turns what he did into irrefutable clinical evidence that a jury can understand." "Okay," she whispered. "Third," I continued, "while we're at the courthouse complex, we're going to the family court division and filing for an emergency temporary restraining order. It's a legal document, signed by a judge, that will forbid him from coming within 500 feet of you, the kids, this house, or their school. If he violates it, he's arrested again, immediately. No questions asked." I paused, letting her absorb it all. "I know this sounds overwhelming. It is overwhelming. This is the part of the process that wears victims down, the part that makes so many of them give up because the system demands so much from them. But you are not going through it alone. I will be with you for every form, every signature, every meeting, and every step. You just have to focus on telling the truth." I expected her to crumble under the weight of it all, but she didn't. I watched as something shifted behind her eyes. The terrified victim was receding, and a flicker of the strong woman I knew she was began to emerge. She straightened her shoulders, wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand, and met my gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but steady. "Okay," she said. "Okay, Dad, what do I need to do first?" A wave of pride washed over me, so powerful it almost took my breath away. The wreckage was all around us, but for the first time, I knew with absolute certainty that she was going to be the one to climb out of it. "First," I said, "standing up, you finish your coffee. Then we go to war." That day was the longest of my daughter's life. We moved through a gray, bureaucratic maze, fueled by coffee and a grim sense of purpose. We spent 3 hours at the police station, while Jess gave her official statement to Detective Rourke, recounting every painful detail in a steady, unwavering voice. We spent another 2 hours at a private clinic, where a doctor documented her injuries with a gentle, professional detachment that was somehow both comforting and chilling. Finally, we navigated the echoing halls of the King County Courthouse, filing the petitions that would legally sever her from the man who had hurt her. With every signature, I could see a little more strength returning to her, a little more of the woman she was meant to be. While we were methodically building a fortress of legal protection around her, Trevor's kingdom, built on a foundation of lies and stolen money, was turning to dust. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about the fallout through the network I had activated. The results were as swift as they were devastating. The first blow was financial. After being processed and booked, Trevor was released on bail, likely paid for by his bewildered parents. His first act as a free man was to try and access his wealth, only to find that it no longer existed for him. Amelia Chen had been as good as her word. The emergency asset freeze had been granted by a judge before the stock market even opened. Trevor's personal accounts were locked, his joint accounts were frozen, his corporate credit cards were deactivated. I imagined him standing at an ATM, his face a mask of disbelief as the screen flashed insufficient funds. The man who defined himself by his net worth was, for all intents and purposes, broke. The second blow was professional. The heads-up to the DA's office and Amelia's legal filings sent shockwaves through Omnitech's executive floor. Before noon, Trevor received a call from his company's chief legal officer. It was not a conversation. It was a termination. I was told the wording was brutal and direct. "Trevor, we have been made aware of your arrest for a violent felony and the pending investigation into financial misconduct. Pursuant to Section 4, Subsection B of your executive employment contract, the morality and ethics clause, your employment with Omnitech is terminated, effective immediately." He was informed that corporate security was packing the contents of his office into a box, and that his access to all company property and systems had been revoked. In the space of a single phone call, his career, his six-figure salary, and his immense corporate power were erased. The final blow was social. His world was built on the perception of success, and with that gone, his so-called friends vanished, like mist in the morning Sunday. The colleagues who had once vied for his attention now sent his calls to voicemail. The powerful couples he and Jess used to entertain suddenly had full calendars. He was no longer a valuable connection. He was a liability, a scandal to be avoided at all costs. He was left completely and utterly alone, a pariah in the very circles he had fought so hard to dominate. In less than 12 hours, Trevor Vance had lost his wife, his children, his freedom, his fortune, his career, and his friends. He had built a magnificent house of cards on a foundation of arrogance, and all it took was the single, gentle breath of truth to bring it all crashing down. He had nothing left now but a court-appointed lawyer and the terrifying, unfamiliar weight of consequences. The wheels of justice grind slowly, even when they are greased by the best legal minds in the city. The 6 months between Trevor's arrest and the start of his trial were a masterclass in legal maneuvering and emotional endurance. His court-appointed public defender, outmatched but duty-bound, tried every trick in the book to delay and obfuscate filing frivolous motions, requesting endless continuances, but we were a rock. For every motion he filed, Amelia Chen had a counter-motion ready. For every delay he requested, the senior prosecutor David Egan assigned to the case was there to argue against it. And through it all, Jess was magnificent. She never wavered, never once suggested dropping the charges or settling for less. The woman who had been systematically silenced for years had found her voice, and she was not going to let it be quieted again. When the day of the trial finally arrived, I sat in the public gallery of the King County Courthouse, a place I knew as well as my own home. For the first time in my professional life, I was a spectator. I had built the engine of this prosecution, but now I had to trust someone else to fly it. My gaze drifted to the jury box. Juror number 3, a retired engineer, would be persuaded only by the logical flow of evidence. Juror number 8, a young mother of 2, was already watching Jess with an expression of quiet, fierce empathy. It was a good jury, a smart jury. Then I looked at Trevor. He sat beside his lawyer, a shadow of the man he once was. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by a sullen resentment. He was thinner, his expensive suit now hanging on his frame, a costume he could no longer afford. He refused to look at Jess, staring instead at the judge's bench with a look of petulant disbelief, as if the entire proceeding was a personal insult arranged just for him. The prosecution laid out the case with methodical precision. Detective Rourke's testimony was clear and professional. The medical report, detailing the extent of Jess's injuries, was entered as Exhibit A. The mountain of financial documents proving the embezzlement was entered as Exhibit B. And then Kendra Rossi, the mistress, was called to the stand. Dressed in a drab, conservative suit, she looked nothing like the confident woman from that morning. She spoke in a monotone, her eyes fixed on her hands, as she corroborated every detail of Jess's story, a reluctant but crucial witness trading her testimony for immunity from the fraud charges. But the trial truly turned the moment Jess took the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head held high, her posture straight, her gaze clear, as the prosecutor guided her through the events of that night. Her voice never broke. It was quiet, but it filled the courtroom with the simple, undeniable power of the truth. The real test came during the cross-examination. The public defender was trying his best. "Mrs. Vance," he began, "isn't it true that you were shouting at my client? That you were enraged when you confronted him?" Jess looked directly at the jury, her expression calm and open. "I was not enraged," she said, her voice steady. "I was terrified. When you find out the man you share your life with is a thief and a liar, it's terrifying. When he screams at you, it's terrifying. When he puts his hands on you, it is the most terrifying feeling in the world. There is a very important difference between anger and terror." He tried another angle. "You threatened him, didn't you? You threatened to go to his company and ruin his career." "No," Jess corrected him gently. "I told him I was going to report a crime. His career was already ruined. He ruined it when he chose to steal. He ruined it when he chose to cheat. And he ruined it when he chose to put his hands around my throat. All I ever did was choose to tell the truth." I sat in the gallery, my heart swelling with a pride so immense it felt like it would crack my ribs. This was my daughter, this strong, brave, articulate woman. He had tried to erase her, but he had failed. In that moment, she was more herself than I had seen her in a decade. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were grim and set. I knew. Trevor, however, still seemed to believe his own charisma would save him. He sat up a little straighter as the foreman stood to read the verdict. On the charge of assault in the 2nd degree, the foreman's voice boomed in the silent room. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Trevor Vance, guilty." A collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Trevor slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut, his face crumbling into a mask of pure shock. He finally looked at Jess, his eyes pleading, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at me, and a single, silent tear of relief was tracing a path down her cheek. The gavel fell, the sound echoing like a final, definitive punctuation mark on the end of a long and terrible sentence. Justice, vindicated and complete, had finally been served. Trevor's conviction for a violent felony made the divorce proceedings a mere formality, a legal epilogue to a story that had already reached its climax. He was out on bail pending his sentencing hearing, a ghost rattling around in a life he no longer controlled. The final meeting was not held in a grand courtroom, but in a sterile, airless conference room in Amelia Chen's downtown law office. It was a place for transactions, not for drama, which was exactly what we wanted. We sat on one side of a long mahogany table, me, Jess, and Amelia. Across from us sat Trevor and his beleaguered public defender. The man who sat there was a stranger. The tailored suits and confident smirk were gone, replaced by a cheap, off-the-rack jacket, and the hollow-eyed gaze of a man who had lost everything and knew it. Before Amelia could even begin, Trevor leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table in a posture of mock prayer. "Jess, please," he began, his voice raspy with a desperation that was utterly devoid of dignity. "Don't do this. Just listen to me for 1 minute." Amelia started to interject, but Jess calmly held up a hand, giving him the floor. She was in control now. "Think about everything we built," he pleaded, his eyes darting between us. "Our home, our beautiful children, our life. Are you really going to throw all of that away over one mistake?" He was trying to sound remorseful, but it came across as whining. "I was under so much pressure, Jess," I snapped. "I know it was wrong, and I will be sorry for it every day for the rest of my life. I'll do anything to make it right. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want, just don't. Don't erase us." He finished, looking at her with what he must have thought was a soul-bearing expression. Jess listened to the entire pathetic performance with a profound and unnerving stillness. When he was done, a long silence hung in the room. Then she leaned forward, her hands folded calmly on the table, and she spoke. Her voice was not loud, or angry, or sad. It was the calm, clear voice of a surgeon delivering a final, incisive diagnosis. "One mistake?" she began, her eyes locking onto his. "Trevor, you didn't make one mistake. The mistake was the entire foundation of our marriage. You think this is about that night? That night wasn't the disease. It was just the ugliest symptom." She took a breath, gathering the strength of a decade's worth of pain and turning it into clarity. "You spent 8 years systematically trying to erase me. You erased my career and called it a gift. You erased my friends and called it protecting me. You erased my self-worth and called it loving me. The hitting, the choking, that wasn't a mistake. That was just the final, desperate act of a tyrant who was terrified he was losing control. That's all you've ever cared about." He started to speak, but she cut him off with a sharp, definitive glance. "And you're not sorry you hurt me," she continued, her voice gaining power. "You are sorry you got caught. You are sorry you lost. There is a universe of difference between those two things." She sat back, the finality of her words settling in the quiet room. "So, to answer your question, yes, I am throwing it all away. I am throwing away the fear, and the excuses, and the shame. I am throwing away the quiet, broken woman I had to become to survive being your wife. I am not her anymore." She then turned to Amelia, her expression shifting to one of crisp, businesslike focus. "Can we sign the papers now?" Amelia slid the thick stack of documents to the center of the table. Jess picked up the pen and, with a hand that was perfectly steady, signed her maiden name, Christine Blackwood, on every page. Her signature was a work of art, fluid, confident, and free. Trevor, when it was his turn, could barely hold the pen. His signature was a jagged, broken scrawl. When it was done, Amelia collected the documents. "That's it," she said quietly. "It's final." Jess stood up. She picked up her purse, smoothed the front of her jacket, and walked toward the door without a single backward glance. She didn't need to. There was nothing left there for her to see. I stood and followed her out, leaving Trevor Vance sitting alone at the table, a legally recognized stranger with nothing left but the life he had single-handedly destroyed. A year can change everything. It's a cliché, but I saw the profound truth of it from the comfort of a porch swing on a warm Saturday afternoon the following September. Trevor Vance was sentenced to 3 years in a state penitentiary for felony assault, with a concurrent sentence for the fraud charges. His appeals were denied. His name faded from the business pages, a brief, spectacular scandal that was quickly forgotten. His story was over, but my daughter's story, the one that truly mattered, was just beginning. I was sitting on the porch of Jess's new house, a charming, century-old craftsman in a quiet, leafy neighborhood. It was half the size of her old, glass-walled prison, but it was 100 times more of a home. There were colorful, chaotic flower pots on the steps, a slightly crooked birdhouse hanging from a maple tree, and a soccer ball worn down from use sitting in the middle of the small green lawn. It was a place filled with the beautiful, messy evidence of a life being lived, not just displayed. From my vantage point, I watched my daughter. She was kneeling in the garden, showing my grandson, Alex, how to properly weed a tomato plant. My granddaughter, Lily, was making a potion out of grass clippings and flower petals on the lawn. Jess was wearing old jeans and a paint-splattered t-shirt, her hair tied up in a messy bun. There were streaks of dirt on her cheek, and she was laughing. It was a sound I had almost forgotten. A free, uninhibited, belly-deep laugh that echoed in the warm afternoon air. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. The quiet, haunted woman who had collapsed in my doorway was gone. In her place was this vibrant, confident person. Her graphic design business, which she'd named simply Blackwood Design, was thriving. She had reclaimed her talent and turned it into a success on her own terms, landing a major contract with a beloved local coffee chain. She was busy, she was challenged, and for the first time in years, she was proud of herself. A man on a bicycle turned onto her street and coasted to a stop at the curb. He was tall and lean, with a kind, open face. This was David, the architect she'd been seeing for the last 6 months. He swung his leg off the bike and pulled a small bag of fresh vegetables from a basket. The kids shouted his name and ran to him, and he greeted them not with the forced enthusiasm of someone trying to impress, but with the easy, genuine affection of a man who simply enjoyed their presence. He walked over to the garden, and I watched the way he looked at Jess. It was a look of quiet admiration, of deep respect. He didn't touch her possessively. He just handed her a ripe heirloom tomato from the bag and smiled as she held it up to the sundae. My prosecutor's gut, the one that had screamed in silent warning for years about Trevor, was now perfectly, peacefully calm. This was a good man. This was a builder, not a destroyer. A few minutes later, Jess came up to the porch, wiping her hands on her jeans, and sat beside me on the swing. We rocked in a comfortable silence for a moment, watching David teach Alex how to properly throw a spiral with a foam football. "It's funny, Dad," she said, her voice soft and content. "I have a mortgage I can barely afford, a house that always needs something fixed, and more work than I've ever had in my life." She looked out at her small, beautiful world, at her happy children, at the kind man playing with them, at the garden she was nurturing with her own hands. And I have never, not for a single second, felt richer. I put my arm around her shoulder and squeezed. "All I ever wanted was for you to be free, sweetheart. To be this." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You helped me get here, Dad," she said. "You built the battering ram that knocked down the prison walls." She turned to look at me, her eyes clear and full of a strength that was now her own. But I was the one who had to be brave enough to walk through the rubble and build something new. We did it together. David called from the lawn. "Jess, are we grilling tonight?" "Absolutely," she called back, her face breaking into another brilliant smile. She stood up and kissed my cheek. "Come on, Dad, let's go eat." I stayed on the swing a moment longer, watching them all trail into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind them. The warm lights flickered on inside, and soon the sound of their combined laughter drifted out into the twilight. My work was done. The last and most important case of my life was officially and happily closed. I was no longer a prosecutor. I was no longer a protector. I was just Grandpa, sitting on a porch, listening to the sound of my family being whole, and it was more than enough.